Hi, Pat. Thanks for being on the show.
Sure. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. I've been following your work for a long time, and I thought it would be great to just get started with more introduction here about you. You've been in the somatic trauma therapy space for basically as long as it's been around. Is that correct, Pat?
Oh, I don't know about as long as it's been around. Pierre Genet was doing somatic work in the 1800s.
Right. I guess that's a good point. I guess once the language around trauma started coming about in the 80s. And so I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about maybe a little bit about body-centered psychotherapy for people that don't know a lot about it, or the history of it, and just, where are we at now? Where did we come from just in terms of body-centered psychotherapy?
Well, I can talk about sensorimotor psychotherapy.
Great.
Sure. And where that started out and where that came from.
Let's do that.
I don't know about speaking for the whole field. It's so diverse. And
it's diverse.
Yeah,
let's do that.
So, sensorimotor psychotherapy is a work that I developed. We founded our institute in 1981. And it's really based on the idea that the movement and posture and gait and sensation of the body both reflects and sustains our psychological issues. So with trauma, perhaps if someone's traumatized, that's going to show up in their body somehow. Like maybe their shoulders are up like this, or maybe they're ready to, be aggressive, or maybe they're pulled in and pulled back. And we look at how the body participates in whatever a client's presenting issues are, so that the body then becomes a really important target of intervention, along with emotions and belief systems and thoughts. So that's it. I think that's body therapy, certainly sensorimotor psychotherapy in a nutshell.
Well, maybe a second part of that conversation is just maybe differentiating out a little sensorimotor psychotherapy from other modalities. What's similar? What's different? That might include the trauma conversation of like SE or EMDR or.
Yeah, I haven't really studied EMDR or these other methodologies, so I don't know about comparisons. I think one, from my background as a body worker, and I'm certified in the Rolfing method of structural integration, which really looks at posture and your line, and if you have the ability in your body to use gravity to lift your body up, which is a natural given ability. If you think of a little baby who's just learning to sit up, they have those super straight spines, you know what I mean? And the reason for that is that they're using gravity to actually not only hold them to the earth, but to lift them up as well. And as we're impacted through relationships and just life experience, our bodies start to shift and it gets out of alignment with gravity. So in my work, I'm really looking at the procedural tendencies of the body, how the body is at peace with gravity, how is it not at peace with gravity, and with the intention of tracking that as we work, not only using those aberrations from gravity as kind of an access route, because say if somebody's pulled in like this, I'm exaggerating, but even a slight bit like this, that has meaning. It could mean I have to hide myself. It could mean somebody's going to hurt me. It has meaning for that person. So as we work through the impact of whatever happened to them through the body, through discovering the meaning and all from the body, I'm also expecting the body to shift. So it's really more at peace with gravity. And that I don't know if it's certainly not unique to sensorimotor psychotherapy, but I think it's an identifying feature for sure.
Mhm. I'm wondering, Pat, if you could tell us what got you interested in the first place in how the body carries these patterns. And
You know, I think it started honestly when I was a little kid, and my mom put me in dance class because at 7 years old, because she knew I was going to be really tall. I'm over 6 feet tall, and she said, "Well, if you're going to be tall, you're going to be graceful, so you're going to start dance." And I remember my dance teacher, Mrs. Bays, trying to teach us just about that poise in the body. I mean, I was 7 years old, and I just got it. And it felt so different. And I felt it, and I still feel it. And so it started way back then. And as a kid, I grew up in the country, and my body was definitely my resource, like physical action. I loved physical challenges. And then in the 70s, I was teaching yoga and dance at a psychiatric hospital, Vanderbilt in Tennessee. And I started noticing, the inpatients that took both yoga and dance started getting better. I mean, maybe they were going to get better anyway, but it piqued my curiosity about the role of the body in psychological healing. And then I met Ron Kurtz in the early 70s, my best friend, most influential mentor. And he was the first person who talked about the body as an access route. Like we can look at the posture of the body and the patterns of the body as an access route into childhood issues. And that was a super critical turning point for me. And I would say, in terms of influences, Ron was the biggest influence, but nobody was talking about trauma in the 70s. Charles Wrigley's book, I think it came out in the late 70s on Vietnam and compassion fatigue and all. Judy Herman's book was over a decade away.
Right.
But I was a counselor referral for Wardenburg Clinic at the University of Colorado here in Boulder in the late 70s. And the patients that they sent me all had sexual issues, like they weren't interested in sex, they weren't able to respond sexually, and so forth. And as I worked with them, they weren't getting better because I was doing everything that I had learned both in social work school and from Ron about active listening and going into the body and going to deep emotions. And my clients were actually some of them are getting worse. And that really bothered me. So I started thinking about what I was doing and thinking that maybe if I just keep them in the body and keep referencing the body and make sure that there's feeling their body and sensing their body as we talk or as we process. And they started getting better, at least not getting worse anymore. So it was from my clients that I first learned about trauma.
Wow.
Not from anybody else. Because all those clients, every single one had been sexually abused, which makes sense, right? So
right.
That was another big turning point for me.
Yeah. Now, sensorimotor psychotherapy, is that, do you define that as a trauma modality, or it's more of a body-centered psychotherapy that works with trauma, or?
Well, I started out in the 70s. Didn't work directly with trauma because nobody knew how to work with trauma. And so, but we were working very much relationally, really with attachment-related issues, although no one really called it attachment back then. But the beliefs that we form in childhood is the result of how our attachment figures interact with us. So I was working very much relationally and very much emotionally. So that is my grounding, is with relationship, with strong emotions in the body. But then it grew into working with trauma. And my first book, in some ways, I mean, it was great, but it was called Trauma and the Body. So I got known kind of for trauma work, but trauma work to me is only part of the being a fully rounded body psychotherapist.
Yeah.
Piece of it.
Well, I think you've spoken to this. You've already spoken to it a bit through procedural memory in the body, and I'm just curious if you can expand a little on, the concept that a lot of people hear, not both just lay people and professionals. There's this concept of things are stored in your body, whether it's memories are stored in your body or trauma stored in your body. I'm wondering if you could just expand on that, of what that means from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, I think about how everything that we experience impacts our bodies. So if we, say, grow up in an atmosphere where our expression is not welcome, I'm going to push this back so maybe people can see my body a little bit. So if I'm not reinforced and given positive reinforcement for being expressive and really showing myself, and just being active, I might start just holding that expression in. And we do that physically, not just with our minds, very much physically, like retention patterns. So if somebody comes into my office with this sort of pattern, right, I'm thinking right away, okay, how did whatever happened to them translate into this kind of posture, right? Because that's not our natural, organic way of living in the body. So when I find that very exciting, and it sort of gets to the root of things much more quickly, because we're really dealing with the implicit part of ourselves, not the part that can talk about everything. This kind of pattern could even develop in infancy, before the hippocampus is online, before memory. So, and I think so. It's, if we speak of it stored in the body, I think of it more as if the body really reflects and sustains our issues. So if a person's body is tight and they're not expressive, that tightness alone is going to sustain that lack of expression and reinforcing a belief of, I shouldn't express myself. But it's also reflected in our nervous systems, our patterns of hyper and hypoarousal, and where we live in that window of tolerance. Is that a term I need to define? Okay. Well, Dan Siegel coined the term window of tolerance in 1999. Before that, I had developed this model, called it the modulation model, where there's, if you think of two parallel lines, and if your arousal can stay kind of within that line, and it goes up when we're really excited, and it goes down when we're sleepy or meditating maybe, but we can bring it back into what Dan calls that window of tolerance. It's like an optimal arousal zone. And when we have trauma, naturally our arousal shoots up way out of the window to mobilize adaptive action, or it can plummet when action is ineffective. And for traumatized people, they can have really dysregulated patterns in their nervous system that we want to recalibrate. Body practice.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pat. I think the implicit piece is, I think, something that I'm really interested in my work with people as well. Yeah. It seems like to me that implicit memory, and we're kind of veering into a conversation about types of memory and how it's stored and so forth, but it seems like unconscious, these automated patterns, it seems like is really where the healing often lives. And I think some of our listeners probably don't know, much about working with implicit memory. And I'm curious what, beyond the recognition that you mentioned of someone's walking in the room and they're tied in a certain way, are there approaches in sensorimotor that elicit these implicit patterns that you can then work with?
Yes, that's a really great question. And this I learned from Ron Kurtz in the 70s. I was so fortunate to meet him when I was in my 20s. He talked about the difference between just talk therapy, just talking about things, and learning about how we organize our experience. Because we could all have a similar experience, like we could all be in a room and somebody screams fire, and we all organize around that very differently. We have different thoughts, different physical responses. When you get into the subtleties of it, even though we all might run out the door, we do that with very different styles, very different emotional valence and everything. And so when we're looking at the organization of experience, we're really looking at what underlies the content. So, for example, if somebody comes into my office and is talking about a rape or a relational issue, like, my partner never supports me, we can use that stimulus to find out the underlying patterns that are driving the responses. So, and that's where mindfulness comes in, because mindfulness really enables us to stop the functioning, really, of the mind and give it another job, which is to observe what's going on inside. So I might say to a client, well, what happens right now when you just think about that rape? Or think about, or say those words, no one supports me, I never get support. What starts to happen inside? And when we ask, that's a mindfulness question, here and now, right now, what happens? And it's getting to the organizational patterns in body, mind, and emotion that drive those experiences. So a client might say, well, when I think about the rape, I start to pull back, my shoulders get tight, I stop breathing, I start to shake, I have these thoughts, I'm going to die, I start to get really terrified. And those, then we can work in the present moment with those patterns. The same with the issue of no one supports me. Well, what happens if you just say that inside? No one supports me. What starts to happen? Well, I start feeling small and my body starts to collapse. I have this image of my mother who was always so busy and blah, blah. And so the mindfulness gets to those underlying organizational phenomena that really drive these limiting experiences. So that's how we approach it. You teach it very, very specifically.
So mindfulness becomes an access point to the implicit layers of memory in the body.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it gets underneath what we think about those.
Right. And then we have an opportunity to remodel the belief systems that are driving the implicit patterns.
Yeah, I think of it in two ways. I think like with relational non-traumatic issues, right? We're really integrating our beliefs, our emotions, and the body, like all three. Like for the person who doesn't get support, who's collapsing and all, they might have beliefs like, no one was ever there, nobody ever supported me. There might be a lot of emotion with that, and, the physical collapse and all. And then we go deeply into that with the emotion and everything. And we kind of go through it, and we work with those child parts that has this posture, and then everything starts to shift. The body starts to shift. They feel more self-support. With trauma, it's a little bit different because trauma, first and foremost, does affect the body. It affects our nervous system and our motor system before it even goes to the fear centers or, our thinking brain. So with trauma, I think of it working more directly just with the body, not with the belief systems or with the emotion, at least at the beginning. Because once we can if your nervous system is dysregulated, the beliefs that go along with that are things like, I'm not safe, I'm in danger, I can't trust anybody. So until the nervous system gets regulated, it's going to be hard to work with beliefs that are different from just trauma. Danger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right now, it seems like a lot of people are feeling that way, not safe, with the pandemic and political turmoil, the, recent deaths of people of color, police. I'm wondering if you have any ideas of, regulation practices that could be useful under these circumstances for people at home and social isolation.
Yeah. Well, I do. I have a lot of ideas, but I want to say one thing though about people of color and Black Lives Matter movement and all the police brutality and the systemic oppression. I mean, that's nothing new. That for people of color, I think the newness is that it's now much more in the collective consciousness, which is a good thing, because until we face the trauma of our history and slavery and the Holocaust, we're not going to be able to heal this, So just like with the sexual abuse survivor, they're not going to be able to heal until they start to acknowledge this happened. And I think we're there collectively. So on the surface, we might be more dysregulated collectively because of the political, the turmoil on many levels, not just Black Lives Matter movement. But I would say that one of the most important tools, I think, is to start to recognize the somatic signs of dysregulation in your own body. Like if your arousal is starting to go up over that window, what happens? You start to tighten up, you hold your breath, do your eyes get wide, does your jaw get tight? And once you have the signals, then do something immediately to regulate, which means work with the body in some way, like get grounded, do some controlled movement, do some self-touch. Some people like to push against the wall, like do something in your body to bring that arousal into the window. And the same if you recognize the signs of your arousal going too low, where you might start to feel numb or like you're shutting down or you're starting to just go blank. Do some movement, go for a walk, do something. And there's many values of that. For one thing, a dysregulated nervous system will compromise your immune function, and we really need our immunity in the days of COVID. And we can't really think clearly when our arousal is outside of that window. So to recognize when it's going outside the window and then do something right away to bring it in to the window, I think is just critical for everybody. I was working with a PA who works in the New York ER, and that's something that she could do even in the ER. And she felt her arousal go up. For her, it was just a little self-touch. And she could do that anywhere. Nobody even knows she's really doing it. Just a little self-touch so she bring her arousal down so she can regulate herself before it gets really out of control.
Just some thoughts on how people can recognize that they're hyper aroused. I mean, I think often it's you sort of are caught up in it, and it's like a day later or a year later where you realize, oh, now I've got a big problem.
Yeah, right. I think it has to do with sensitivity to your body, because that's really the first place it's going to show up. Like when I work with clients, I'll even say to them, I'll say, okay, so think of that trigger from yesterday, like when you read the news. just think of it a little bit, and what's the first thing that happens in your body? And they say, well, my neck feels back. Okay, great. So that's the first signal. And sometimes you go through what happens next, and next when my shoulders tighten, I stop breathing, I start going, almost gasping for breath and blah, blah, blah. But see, it's that first signal where you have the chance to change it. And everybody's body is so different. So you can't say that neck thing was really specific to that person. My neck doesn't pull back when I get triggered. You know, my left shoulder comes in and I lose my movement a little bit. But it's different for everybody. So people have to develop that sensitivity. And I think also identifying your triggers. Like for many of us, you know, we can look at the news for like a half hour and then realize our hearts are racing, we're tight, we're not breathing, or we've gone numb. So if we know that's a trigger, we can titrate our exposure.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could comment too on, excuse me, on this concept of resiliency and sensitivity, and how, you know, one person who's dysregulated for an extended period of time might develop what we would call pretty, you know, severe psychiatric symptoms from that. The next person, it might show up differently, but not really as a big mental health disorder. Like
Yeah.
they just seem to, you know, have a different constitution. Their sensitivity level is different. Their resiliency level. Can you just comment on that? So your perspective on like how, you know, why does stress impact people really differently? And some people seem to be able to get by in certain ways and other people get really leveled by it.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it's cumulative, you know, and if we haven't resolved or to some degree resolved our histories of trauma and stress, if we haven't learned how to regulate our nervous system, so it keeps piling on, you know. So, and I think that's part of what's happening right now is the trauma of the pandemic and the really the trauma of what's happening in the U.S. with the upheaval around Black, Indigenous people of color, and also politically. I think it brings up implicitly our past unresolved traumas. So I think that's one reason. But we overlook also that the resilience that is often developed from these kinds of challenges. Like I was reading a paper just yesterday, actually, about intergenerational transmission of resilience for Black Americans, and there were studies that show that there's an increased ability and resiliency in many of that population to handle current traumatic events because of the history of trauma has just brought that forward, even epigenetically. So it's a complicated topic, you know. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it did, and you know, you were talking before about, you know, implicit memory and then also beliefs and how that shows up in your modality. And I am also curious too with, you know, I think there's a lot of really scared and confused people right now, angry. There's a lot of issues we're facing that are more just surfaced right now. They've always been here. And I'm just curious about the role of meaning making in the work you've done, and you know how any thoughts too on that with just what everybody's facing right now.
Well, I mean, meaning making, I think of it, thanks to Ed Tronick, one of my friends and brilliant colleagues. He really elucidates that meaning making is not just one thing. It's not cognitive. We also make meaning with our body, with our imagery, with our emotions, with our nervous system. He calls it polymorphic meaning making. And we also have, it's complex. It's not just one meaning. We can have many, many different meanings about the same situation. We do look at how meaning is held in the body, like the meaning of that tension pattern that I showed, meaning, I can't express myself. I think that's critical. I do think, as Martin Luther King and many others have pointed out, that losing hope, it can be really devastating. And I think right now, especially with many marginalized communities, the pandemic is super challenging because of facing that pandemic already at a financial disadvantage, right? Many people are afraid of losing their homes, losing everything, losing their jobs, or being separated from their children and being deported. And there's so much kind of unnecessary stress due to the systemic oppression that we're living in. I think I forgot the point of your question. Do you want to?
I think you answered it because you basically spoke to that meaning making is multifaceted, and that obviously also very relevant in relation to without certain meaning making, we can go into hopelessness.
Yeah.
Is what I took from your answer, which is also pretty devastating to be in that experience of hopelessness.
Yeah. You know what I'm thinking? In the trauma field, we always talk about if you're able to take action, if you're able to do something to make the trauma less bad or protect yourself, that is strengthening. And people are less likely then to experience PTSD from it. So I think of that now, too. If we can take some action, like anything, help your neighbor, contribute to the Black Lives Matter movement, contribute to retributions, there's so many avenues to support things expanding instead of constricting.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that.
I didn't mean retributions, I meant reparations. That didn't sound right. Reparations, contribute to reparation. Sorry.
But I'm glad you said that, Pat, because you said at the beginning of the talk what happens when you basically are losing the permission to express as a child, and then what can happen posturally and also obviously psychologically from that. And it seems like it's just such an important message that if we're just talking about racism, that it's so important that people have a space to express about what's going on right now.
That's right. Yeah, and to actually, do it in whatever way is right for you. Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book on how to become an anti-racist, is brilliant. He talks about it's not enough just to say you're not racist. You need to become an anti-racist to combat the systemic oppression and to combat the systemic oppressive policies that we're suffering from, that is doing a disservice to so many people.
I'm muted there. Sorry. I was thinking about this movement from, we could call it freeze response, or how to move into agency, which I think is what I've been reading about how to become an anti-racist. Is it actually requires proactive movement.
That's right.
To actually take responsibility for changing this this culture or this systemic oppression.
Right.
And I automatically think about the vagal nerve when I think about, moving out of paralysis and into engagement, um, which takes me to the possibility of relationship. And when you said, Keith, a few minutes ago, like how do you actually, if you're already way past dysregulated and you don't know that you are, I'm wondering about your perspective, Pat, on you've spoken about secure functioning and relationships. And I'm wondering how you feel about the role of the partner or the friend in terms of addressing some of these patterns that we're talking about.
Well, I mean, relationship is essential. We're wired to connect with others, whether it's your partner, your friends, your kids, your family, your animals, your plants, nature. That's how we're built. We're social beings, and I think that's what's been hard for so many with the pandemic is finding ways to actually connect. And one of the ways I look at that literally is through what John Bowlby called proximity-seeking actions, because we learn patterns of connection as we grow up. So often I've asked a client just to reach out, because proximity-seeking actions have to do with reaching, moving closer, making eye contact, really seeking proximity with others. And one client reached out. Oh, you can't see my arm. How can I do this? Okay. Reached out like halfway, like this, with her elbow to her side, and she said, "Why would I reach out? Nobody's ever been there for me. I was left alone all the time." Another guy reached out with his arm stiff, his palm down like this. So his body actually was pulling back at the same time. And he said, I'm on my own. He said, nobody defended me, nobody protected me, nobody. My parents were like absent. And those proximity-seeking habits that show up in our body have everything to do with how we seek proximity with others. So it's a great avenue to explore, because we learn. You see this in Ed Tronic's videos with the little babies, where he
still face experiment.
Still face, yeah. And the mother, he has well, not always the mother, the caregiver, have a blank face. And you'll see the babies like desperately reaching out, trying to get their attention. But then after a while, they give up, they lose their postural integrity. And you think, okay, if that continued over childhood, they would stop reaching out to others, because if it's not capable of producing a desired outcome, well, then we're not going to do it. And those are the procedural habits that really can interfere with our ability to draw on relationships, that co-regulation, to help us stay in our window and to give us that sense of belonging and nurturance.
Do you have some tips for couples or close friends about how to help people get along better? It's so hard, obviously. It's really hard to get along, right? In a relationships are hard to do well, and all the different modalities have different ways. We talked to Stan Tacken recently. There's his modality has a lot of body tracking involved. So I'm curious from your perspective of. Do we need to be learning a new language here of how to track people's bodies? Is that a part of getting along? Like, what are your thoughts? How do we do this?
When I work with couples, this is something that we're really developing in sensorimotor psychotherapy. I strongly feel that the content is never the issue. The fight that they come on with, or the little hurts, the content, what happened. It's never the issue. It's their body-to-body conversation that's the issue. I have found that, I would say, I don't like to use absolutes, but I've never found that not to be true. that's the core of it. And it has to do with what you're talking about meaning too, because, for example, a couple that I worked with, they fought all the time. And they said, we go from 0 to 60 and like that, and we just fight constantly. And they loved each other very much, and they didn't want to get divorced or anything. And they've been working with a talk therapist, and who'd given them homework like take a break, take 10 minutes apart, and come back together. But they say, so we do that, but then we start blaming each other, like, you didn't really calm yourself down. You're still mad, and it just wasn't working. So when I asked them just to remember the last fight, which was the night before, but it was all there. It was just, she felt this rising energy and this, to make a long story short, this kind of leaning forward and this kind of aggressive impulse. He felt himself pull back, start to shut down. His fingers went up like this, his hand went up, and there it is, right there, right? When they get stressed, he pulls away and tries to defend. She wants to get closer and gets a little bit attacking. But it was all, and they all make meaning about that. Hers was, he doesn't even want to engage with me, he's going to leave me. And this was implicit until we started going with the body. His was, she's just going to attack me. What's the point? So that was outside of their awareness. That was implicit communication. And so we explored that through mindfulness and through doing that pattern. And it was just so illuminating. And with this couple, I felt like they were so solid and they really wanted to shift it. So I did a little experiment where she went ahead and did that pattern. And I asked her husband, instead of pulling back, to reach out to her. And I mean, she just melted. It was like, that's all she ever wanted, right? So that was one of their tools then that they could use during their arguments. And they wrote me a few weeks later and said that it was really great to have that in their toolbox, but they hadn't needed to use it because now they understood that these were patterns left over from childhood. So I think often with couples, it's a matter of elucidating experientially those implicit patterns, and how it's communicated body to body and how they make meaning of each other. That's usually so hurtful that just exacerbates the arguing. So that's in a very concise way how I see couple therapy.
What are some? That's great, and I mean I view it a lot that way too, personally and professionally. And I'm curious, what are some tips for people at home of like where do you start? You don't have a therapist, and how do we just have a new way of being with each other where we can actually spot some of these things?
That's a good question. I'm thinking. I mean, to me, it always kind of gets back to mindful awareness, and curiosity, which is hard. It's hard to do when you're in the midst of a emotional, emotionally charged situation with a close relationship. I've worked with some clients who have agreed that when they start to escalate, that they will drop the content, just say, we're not going to talk about it. Because it's that window of tolerance thing. When they get outside of the window, there's no point in talking about it because I can guarantee you're not going to get anywhere. Yeah. So if you can recognize those signs of going out, that's for this couple, and then make an agreement together that if you feel yourself going out, either of you, that you'll say, okay, I can't talk right now because I'm not going to make any sense. And if you can own that, even though you feel like you're making perfect sense, and then you can both do whatever you need to regulate. And sometimes it's co-regulation, and sometimes people just need to hold each other and not talk and feel their connection. Sometimes it's doing it yourself, like, take a breath or whatever. I had one couple who they just had a different thing going on, and for her, she had to place her hands on her heart and say to herself, I can take care of myself when they escalated. He placed his hands on his belly where he felt a dysregulated little kid to hold that little kid when they got into their fights. And just seeing each other do that gesture brought the both of their arousals and their relational dysregulation into that window. People are always looking for a one-size-fits-all or a formula, and our bodies are so unique, and our relationships are so unique that's why awareness is so important. If you know your body and its triggers, and learn the regulation, and if you can do that as a couple or in a relationship, it can be so supportive. But I don't know how you can do that without awareness. Yeah.
It sounds like really a call to action for people to get to know their own system.
Yeah.
To develop that awareness of their own triggers and of their partner's triggers.
Yeah.
And to begin the process through awareness to, like in the example you gave of inviting the partner to go forward rather than back, to begin to break up or disrupt these unconscious patterns.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right, Will. And I think, you learn what your partner needs. And this is a big part of Stan's work. So, in a solid relationship, there's people often just learn to kind of give each other what you need right now to calm down and not have to be right.
Yeah.
I remember one couple, it was so clear that the wife she just wanted to be right, so I asked her if she'd just say that out loud, like, being right is more, I think I had to say, being right is more important to me than really connecting with you. And as soon as she said that, she's like, that's not true. And I'm like, well, and he was like, that's what I'm hearing. And these fun little experiments can just shift the dynamic. And they don't have to be so serious. Like, that was just sort of fun, and teasing. But, they got it.
Beautiful.
Well, Pat, how should people learn more about your work? Is there anything you want to highlight right now?
Well, let's see. I'd like to, they can go to the website, sensorimotor.org. There's lots of free resources and webinars that we're offering, just kind of like whatever you can pay. I think they start at $20 or something. So, so that's a great resource. We are offering trainings online now, like a whole trauma training online. I have a new book coming out, which is timely. It's been in the works for over 5 years, called A Pocket Guide to Sensorimotor Psychotherapy in Context, which is really speaking to systemic depression and how we can address those issues through our work, and also the history of Western Eurocentricity in psychotherapy as a whole, and how we're just beginning, and it was designed by white folks for that population, so acknowledging that. And there's also one book that people might be interested in who aren't going to do training. That's a book I wrote with Janina Fisher in 2015. It's called Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Trauma and Attachment. The reason that might be helpful is there are, I think, 32, 35 chapters, short chapters that we tried to make user-friendly, that clients as well could read, or the layperson could read, and it's accompanied by worksheets. And you can get, I'm going to tell people, the worksheets are impossible to Xerox from the book, but you can order them from Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute, and they'll just send you a PDF link. So those are some resources that would be helpful.
Terrific.
Great. Well, we end similarly with everyone, which is, if there was a billboard that every human being would see at one point in their lifetime. You could put a paragraph on there. What would you want them to know?
Oh, I know Will sent me that question. I thought that's hard to put in a billboard. I mean, the thing that I feel people could benefit from is really valuing the body as an avenue of exploration and change, and realizing that your body holds everything that you've ever experienced. So when you get familiar with it and its patterns and its gestures and its movements, you have so many more opportunities to grow and to change and to have the life that you wish. I guess that would be my billboard.
Hey. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Pat. It was I deeply appreciate all the work you've done for the field and for human beings. I mean, you've really played your part in understanding how to be inside a body and how to try and live well in that body. So thank you for all that, and thank you for being on the show.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Good to meet you both.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah.